Hi guys, welcome to AP US History with Lennox. I'm Lennox and we are in AP Time Period 3, which covers the years 1754 to 1800. And today we're looking at topic 3.3, taxation without representation. But before we get to that, let's recap a little bit. The colonies are moving towards war with Great Britain, but we still got a little bit of a ways to go. We have just come out of the French-Indian War, and the effects of the French and Indian War are really what's going to propel us towards this war with Great Britain. The war had been very expensive for Great Britain, and they're going to start looking for sources of revenue to help pay off that war. And one of the main ways that governments raise money? Taxation. So that's going to be one of the tools they use to deal with the debt they have. They believe they have every right to come in and tax the citizens of the British colonies because, well, number one, they're British citizens, and number two, they're living in British territory. So it just stands to reason that they have to pay the same taxes that are being paid by other British citizens throughout the world. And probably the biggest reason that Great Britain thought they had this right was because they had just fought a war in North America defending the British colonists from French encroachment. So yeah, you guys are going to help pay for this war. One of the first things they do is they look at the policy of salutary neglect. Now, if you remember correctly, salutary neglect has been present in the colonies for over 100 years. Now, make no mistake, Great Britain had political sovereignty over the colonies. They had the right to rule the colonies. The problem they faced was the colonies were so far away, it was very difficult to provide any direct forms of governance. So what Great Britain allowed to happen was the colonies started creating their own governments, and self-rule became common. One area that Great Britain had always tried to control was trade. Remember, mercantilism was the sole purpose of these colonies, and trade is the mechanism of mercantilism. So in the mid-1600s, Great Britain passed the Navigation Acts, and the Navigation Acts were supposed to protect the exclusiveness of trade between the colonies and Great Britain. And they passed rules like colonial goods could only be transported on British ships. Certain goods could only go directly to Great Britain. If you were trading with other areas, those ships had to first stop in British ports in order to be taxed. So all of those were set up to protect the trade that Great Britain had set up with the colonies. But over time, they weren't being enforced, and the colonists were seeing that it was very easy for them to get into the practice of smuggling goods all over the country and making their own money. Well, the Prime Minister, George Grenville, and Parliament said, you know what? Salutary neglect, that's done. And Grenville is going to institute a plan to regain control of the economics of the colonies. The first thing he's going to start doing is start enforcing existing laws. They're going to do that by extending the wartime provision of soldiers in the colonies. He's also going to pass the Quartering Act of 1765, which essentially told the colonists, we're sending these soldiers over to make sure you're obeying the law, and oh, by the way, you have to give them a place to live. So you can see reasons for why tension was starting to rise between the colonists and Great Britain. Grenville is also going to institute new taxes. The first one is going to be the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act was a tax on luxury goods like wine and coffee, but it also reinforced a previous law that had been put in place, the Molasses Act, a tax on sugar. Perhaps the most notorious tax that's going to be passed under Grenville's plan is the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax on all paper products produced in the colonies. In addition to the Stamp Act, Parliament also passed the Currency Act. And the Currency Act made it illegal for any of the colonies to print their own currency. Only English currency will be used in the colonies. Well, that's going to cause a decrease in the supply of currency in the colonies. And if you pair that with the fact at the same time, wages were decreasing. And so there was a bit of an economic crisis going on in the backdrop of Grenville's plan. This is when the colonists started questioning what is going on. How can Parliament pass these laws against us? They're not even giving us a chance to voice our opinion. And they started using a phrase, no taxation without representation. And they started calling for the government to give them their voice. Now, where would they get a crazy idea like that? Oh yeah, the Enlightenment. If you remember from a previous lesson, the Enlightenment ideas had come into the colonies about 30 years earlier. And the idea of natural rights from John Locke and a social contract that exists between the people and their government. And the colonists started saying, hey, we are part of that social contract. We want a voice because we feel that our government is not protecting us the way they should. Parliament's going to come back at them and say, whoa, whoa, whoa. You have representation. You have virtual representation in Parliament. Because when every single member of Parliament takes office, they take an oath to serve every British citizen, no matter their location, no matter their standing in society. If you are part of a British territory or country, you are represented in Parliament. The colonists weren't buying it. So what you had was a complete different viewpoint of what representation was based on in government. Great Britain is going to tell you that representation is based on class. Whereas the colonists are going to say, no, representation should be based on location. So as a result of the actions of Parliament, such as the Stamp Act and the Currency Act, organizations started to form, such as the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And the colonies are going to create the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act Congress was made up of 27 delegates from 9 different colonies. And what they are going to do is they are going to petition Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, I want to be very clear at this point in history. The colonists were not saying anything about independence. In fact, in their petitions that they sent to Parliament, they swore a loyalty to the king and to Great Britain. They were still happy being British citizens. They just wanted their voice to be heard. And initially, it worked out because Parliament is going to repeal the Stamp Act. They're going to repeal the Sugar Act. But because Parliament needs to have the last word, in 1766, they passed the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act essentially said, we're Parliament. We can pass any law we want, whenever we want, over whoever we want. We've got the power. But for a time being, things calmed down until the next year, 1767, the Townshend Acts are going to be passed. And these are taxes on goods such as paint and paper and lead and glass. And well, the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, they're back at it. And what's interesting is you're going to see a highly organized protest of boycotts of English-made goods. And the group leading this is the women, because it was the women who did all the purchasing. And so they organized this boycott, and instead of buying fabric from Great Britain, they're going to start making their own fabric. It was called homespun. And instead of drinking the tea that was being imported, that was being taxed, they're going to start making their own herbal tea. And what these boycotts are going to do is they're going to start unifying the colonies in one accord against the taxation of Great Britain. 1770, blood is going to be shed. The first drops of blood on the road to independence. In Boston, Massachusetts, the number of troops had increased, and it wasn't uncommon for the citizens of Boston to harass those troops. One night, citizens began to harass a squad of soldiers. They started throwing snowballs at them, calling them names. Things got out of hand. Somebody fired a shot, and then all of a sudden the soldiers turned their weapons and started firing into the crowd. In the end, 11 people had been wounded, 4 had been killed. The soldiers were actually put on trial, and they were defended by a colonist, future president of the United States, John Adams. And 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted. They were found not guilty. You would think things would start to calm down after that. And they did for a bit, until 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act. The Tea Act restricted the type of tea that could be sold in the colonies. It restricted it to one company, creating a monopoly. Colonists were now only able to purchase tea from the West India Trading Company. Well, the colonists didn't like this. They were used to Dutch tea They were used to being able to make their own choices. And so members of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk Indians, are going to board the British ships as they come in and dump all of that tea from the West India Trading Company into Boston Harbor. We're talking 45 tons of tea that was dumped into the harbor. Tea that would have a street value today of about $2 million. Well, there's no other way to put this. Parliament was ticked. And Parliament's going to pass the Coercive Acts, a series of acts deemed to punish Boston and the colonies for those lost revenues from that tea. One part of the Coercive Acts was they shut down Boston Harbor. No ships coming in, no ships going out. Trade essentially came to an end. They also passed another Quartering Act because they're sending more troops into Boston, into other regions of the colonies, and you colonists have got to put them up in your homes. People of Boston referred to these as the Intolerable Acts. How are we supposed to tolerate this mistreatment? And as a result of all of this, you're going to start seeing the colonies put together militias. But that is what we'll talk about in another video. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them below. Other than that, we'll see you on the next one.